This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Okay, so why don't we go ahead and begin? We've got 4 very interesting presentations today, so we'll get going. This is the second of our 2 PhD seminars. We're trying to do the Comparative Histories of Asia seminar, trying to do slightly different things. And the first one I thought was a real success. We heard 3 very interesting papers, and it looks like we've got 4 really fantastic ones to come. So I'm going to introduce them one at a time. We'll do the papers in a row and then have questions for everyone at the end, if that's okay. I'm going to give you each 15 minutes, and then I might be nice and give you an extra 2 or 3, and then I'm going to come and bash you over the head if you're still talking. So first is Joshua de Cruz from Birkbeck, with his paper called A Liar's Ideology, Lai Teck's Communism.
Good evening, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. The picture up there is the photograph is of Lai Teck. It's one of only 2 known photographs of Lai Teck, so in a visual sense, this presentation is limited. Okay. My project looks at the impact of war, imperialism and their consequences upon the core ideologies of modern times: communism, nationalism and liberalism. My aim is to consider these in a specific place and time, colonial Singapore of the 1940s, testing the limits of ideology under the extreme circumstances of invasion, occupation and its aftermath. By examining the actions of prominent Asian and Eurasian civilians, men who embrace these imported values in different ways, the ideological conscience is subject to an intense scrutiny, and another dimension to the intellectual history of 1940s Asia is found, and the spaces between the myth of the good war and the critic of victor's justice are revealed. Apart from Lai Teck, I'm also looking at an Indian lawyer called S.C. Goho, who was the president of the Indian Independence League in Singapore, and Charles Paglar, who was a doctor and head of the Eurasian Welfare Association, and both were put on trial by the British after the war as collaborators. The mixed motives of men who prospered under the rule of the British and the Japanese raise questions of degrees of coercion and collaboration, and show it was possible for them to adapt to prevailing political winds to maintain authority. In such a situation, can we recover anything beyond naked self-interest and an overriding instinct for survival? Power does not always override ideology, as, despite shifting allegiances, a form of ideological consistency is kept throughout the turbulent years of World War. The case of Lai Teck is problematical but compelling. Facts about his life and motivations remain hidden, and those available are contested. This was a man with over 20 known aliases, including Lai Teck. His real name is unclear. It is difficult to make any claims about him without qualification. However, his unique trajectory through the first half of the 20th century deserves examination. Lai Teck was the Secretary General of the Malayan Communist Party, the MCP, from 1939 to 1947, and a traitor. He was born of mixed parentage, Vietnamese and Chinese, around 1903. As a communist, he came to the attention of the French Sûreté in Indochina, and when they had finished with him, he was passed to the Special Branch, who brought him to Singapore. Lai Teck manoeuvred himself into the leadership position on the Central Executive Committee of the MCP, and became a priceless source in the struggle against the Red Menace. The conquest of Malaya by Japan led to an exchange of imperial masters for Lai Teck. Caught during the infamous Suk Ching mass screenings, Lai Teck became a Japanese agent. The mask would slip, and Lai Teck fled Malaya and the MCP in March 1947, taking most of their gold and money with him. But his past caught up with him, and he was killed in Bangkok in 1948. In the ongoing debate over the beginning of the Malayan emergency, it is significant the MCP's return to the jungle coincided with their confusion and humiliation following Lai Teck's exposure. However, this paper is not an inquiry into the origins of the Malayan emergency, but an exploration of the tensions between power and ideology, means and ends. The limited reconstruction of Lai Teck's sketchy life is based on security sources, intelligence reports of the French, British and Japanese, and the memoirs and documents of the MCP. These primary sources are partial and from entrenched positions and can obscure as much as reveal. Documents previously unconsidered have been found in the archives of the Communist Party of Great Britain. The presence of this material indicates a direct connection between the MCP and the CPGB at this time. They include reports, propaganda and pamphlets, and the only record of a speech unknown to previous studies of the MCP. Today I'll concentrate on this speech, given by Lai Teck in Singapore on the 8th of December 1945. It was published as a small pamphlet entitled The New Outlook and the New Impending Tasks of the Malayan Peoples, speech delivered by Comrade Wright in the meeting celebrating the 4th anniversary of 8th December Day, Comrade Wright being one of Lai Teck's pseudonyms. It is an attempt by Lai Teck to reassert ideological control of the movement at a critical juncture and is significant on a number of levels. Firstly, Lai Teck was struggling to maintain control over the MCP, as despite success in the political and industrial arena, younger, more militant comrades were itching for a return to violence. Disappointed the MCP's military arm had not pressed home its apparent advantage and, as in Indochina and Indonesia, seized its opportunity to take power before the return of the Europeans. Secondly, its appearance in English is evidence of the MCP reaching out from its dominant Chinese base to other racial groups in Malaya. The cache contains material for the Chinese, Indian, Malay and English-speaking communities. Thirdly, it was consistent at that time with known trends of communist thought. Lastly, by postponing the armed struggle, Lai Teck would please his imperial spy masters, and he had already ordered the MCP's Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army to lay down their arms on the 1st of December 1945. Lai Teck surveys events across the globe, imperialist interventions in Asia, Britain's reactionary colonial policy, the creation of a Western European bloc, and imperialist attempts to encircle the Soviet Union. The, quote, imperialist reactionary united front, end quote, supports fascism's remnants while the Soviet Union is slandered with false reports from Reuters and is attacked economically through the Bretton Woods Agreement. However, the defeat of fascism and the heroic example of the Red Army has awakened the consciousness of the world, and the people, quote, find mutual coordination in actions to form a common objective which propels all peoples of the world to fight for democracy, national independence and safeguard socialism, end quote. This is standard stuff, language and style typical, and though the CPGB bemoaned the MCP's ignorance of Marxist classics, nothing here would challenge their limited knowledge. His analysis of local events is couched in dogma, but clear. The British want to reinstate the old days of colonial dominance. Malaya is being used as a military base for aggression against Indochina and Indonesia and is exploited economically by a bankrupt Britain. Imperial pressure backfires as an awakened populace, quote, begin to enter the stage of universal anti-imperialism, end quote. The divide between capitalists and socialists has seemingly only one outcome. Quote, the subsequent historical development of mankind has manifested the more acute of confrontation between the capitalists and the proletariats to transform into an era of bloody conflict. In every country of the world, besides those socialist and pro-socialist nations, class struggle has become more acute, with more intense possibility of bloodshedding conflict." End quote. Lai Teck has introduced the prospect of the armed conflict the militants desire. Bloodshed always followed in Lai Teck's wake and was his most useful tool in acquiring and securing power. Political rivals were betrayed to the British and deported to Kuomintang, China, resulting in certain death. Hundreds were killed by the Japanese. Central was destroyed, and by early 1943 he was in complete control of the party. At the time of this speech, Lai Teck had just ordered the killing of 130 Japanese soldiers who had chosen to join the MCP rather than surrender to the British. Lai Teck can be seen as the personification of the classic Bolshevik leader, where violence is used as a political weapon. The question is, as always with Lai Teck, in whose interest is the weapon wielded? However, Lai Teck retreats from launching the armed struggle as Malaya is unprepared. Quote, "Nevertheless, prior to the exposition of the radical fragileness of imperialism, it is necessary that we should intensify the training of the masses to strengthen our potential power in determining the decadence and destructions of imperialism." End quote. The implication is clear. The movement is not ready. Lai Teck has offered a sop to the militants. The armed struggle is acknowledged, but more work needs to be done. Paradise is postponed. Holding them back is Malaya's plural society with its main racial groups, Malays, Chinese and Indians, pulled in different ways and directions, socially, economically and politically. The unity of a, quote, all-racial united front, end quote, is needed as there is, in Lai Teck's words, unbalanced development. The party must reach outside its narrow Chinese base through industrial action and by infiltrating and encouraging nascent political groups like the Malay National Party and the Malayan Democratic Union. Lai Teck speaks of the responsibility and necessity of enlarging the movement and, quote, maintaining harmonious unity of three races to relieve us of the imperialistic domination, end quote. He reviews the past 3 months since the Japanese surrender and notes the success of this burgeoning movement in the form of widespread economic unrest and the forming of the new democratic groups. This in turn is drawing in an ever-increasing mass following, including members of the middle classes and the intelligentsia. He's following Mao's New Democracy path, which argues for a two-step process for taking power. The first step involving the party in a broad alliance of classes and interests in a democratic push for control. Hindsight finds Lai Teck's claims as being essentially correct. Britain had finished the war in debt to the US, and the dollar value of Malaya's tin and rubber exports exceed the value of the UK's total exports to the United States. This was a determining factor in deciding the British stance on Malayan independence, acting as a brake on an apparently sympathetic Labour administration. The MCP-controlled General Labour Union and the new political parties had succeeded in mobilising mass protests. The MCP now enjoyed legal status in Malaya, and representatives from the MCP were invited to sit on the various legislative authorities under the British military administration. These economic and political gains, together with the heroic myth of the Malayan people's anti-Japanese army, represent a high point in MCP popularity and influence. They even received the backing of influential British policymakers like Victor Purcell. This Malayan spring did not last, and by the time of Lai Teck's speech, the 8th of December 1945, it was threatened by militancy, corruption and violence. For 10 years, Lai Teck had successfully negotiated the deadly terrain of secrecy and power, each betrayal incrementally increasing his influence and usefulness. The personality cult of Lai, Malaya's Lenin, developed during the war. He could pass unseen through Japanese lines, drive tanks and fly planes, compassionate and indestructible. As a good Bolshevik, Lai Teck knew ends justify means and would vindicate all the deaths and betrayals. Any inconvenient truths would stay buried. It should have been clear to any but the hot-headed that Malaya was not ready for revolution. The MCP's base was too narrow and the strength of the British was still too great. A premature descent into rebellion would jeopardise everything he had worked for. Should he lose control of events, he would be at the mercy of the British and the MCP. In response, Lai Teck attempts a skillful manoeuvre: appeal to the militants whilst maintaining a steady policy to placate the British. Quote, "The revolutionary movement of Malaya has entered a stage necessitating the enhancement of racial liberation consciousness and the preparations for welcoming the soaring tide of anti-imperialism. In welcoming this new situation, the Communist Party of Malaya calls for universal unity to repulse the reactionary forces of imperialism." End quote. He concludes by making three proposals. Firstly, stay on the, quote, "the right course," end quote, of unifying the three races. Secondly, broaden the movement in a, quote, "union of workers, peasants, middle classes, the intelligentsia and the masses," end quote. Thirdly, mass opposition and, quote, "strive to defeat the imperialistic reactionary policy by all racial united power to achieve democracy," end quote. This is the new policy designed to buttress his position. The new impending tasks are not optional but prerequisites. Quote, "the obligations of all Malayan peoples under the present circumstances," end quote. Ideologically, it is a clear speech, if somewhat repetitious, and consistent with the doctrines of the Popular Front and New Democracy, in line with Stalin and Mao. Beneath this apparent simplicity, Lai Teck is performing a precarious balancing act. He is trying to achieve four things at once. Firstly, to be credible in his analysis of Malaya. Secondly, this analysis must be sufficiently compelling to convince the MCP. Thirdly, it must satisfy the British he is still someone to do business with. And finally, it must direct events in the best interests of Lai Teck himself. Can we trust the words of the most untrustworthy man in Malaya? Lai Teck can be seen as complex and compromised, with a chameleon ideology. This is an attempt to penetrate his mask, to look beyond a self-serving collaboration and uncover an ambiguity in ideas and action, one not only necessary for survival but the norm. As Trotsky wrote, there is a difference between their morals and ours. Lai Teck is not alone in confusing his own interests with those he claimed to serve, and he may well have convinced himself that his many betrayals would seem petty compared with the realisation of a greater good. It is a dark irony of history that when they abandoned Lai Teck's strategy, the MCP gave up their best chance of success. In colonial Singapore, Asians and Eurasians had exchanged one imperial master for another, with the defeat of the British by the Japanese. Moral concepts and certainties, old and new, came under intense stress, and this was only made worse with Britain's return. Singapore was a pressure cooker where the three paramount ideologies of the time, liberalism, nationalism and communism, were tested to their limits. From the Allies to the Axis and back again, alliances were made, status maintained, ideologies apparently intact. Thank you. And if anybody would like to have a look at the pamphlet of the speech, I've got a copy here, so you can look at it. Anybody interested can look at it afterwards. It's got a bit wet though. Thank you.
Alright, so our next speaker is Vivienne Guo, who's working at King's College London, and her talk really has two titles, the one that you'll see on the PowerPoint and the one I'm going to give you here, which is The Political and Gender Roles of Chinese Intellectual Women in the War of Resistance, 1937 to 1945.
Good evening, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about beyond identity and personalizing the political experience of Chinese intellectual women in the war of resistance between 1937 and 1945. I'm going to basically introduce 6 examples of intellectual women with different political backgrounds during the war, and they held different political and gender roles. I try to argue that intellectual women, like their male peers, were engaged in the political mobilization of national resistance and the production of wartime ideologies. However, resistance and women's emancipation did not shape intellectual women's political and gender roles in the same way. And the ideological difference between the nationalist or the Kuomintang and the communist or the CCP, or that between traditional and what was believed to be modern, could not fully explain intellectual women's political choices and identities during the war. Therefore, intellectual women's political and gender roles have been shaped and reshaped under the fast-changing political, social, and economic conditions during the war, and they were further reinterpreted and re-evaluated in the post-war years in different political contexts. And so first, I'm going to talk about the same resistance but different political choices or different political paths. And we're going to introduce 3 women, Tan Tiwu, Cao Mengjun, and Ding Ling. You can see Tan Tiwu and Cao Mengjun, the first photo. One is on the left and the other on the right-hand side. And Ding Ling, I think most people are more familiar with her very famous left-wing female writer of the wartime period. In the 1920s, Tan Tiwu, Cao Mengjun, and Ding Ling, these 3 ladies, were very close friends studying in Beiping, today's Beijing. After the National Revolution failed, Tan Tiwu and Cao Mengjun went to Nanjing to work for the nationalist government, while Ding Ling joined the League of Left-Wing Writers in Shanghai and converted to communism. In the face of Japanese aggression in East China, Cao Mengjun and Tan Tiwu joined the National Salvation Association in Nanjing and migrated to the wartime capital Chongqing in 1938, when the majority of Chinese intellectuals from the occupied region in East China. But Ding Ling, on the other hand, after her 3 years of detention by the Kuomintang in Nanjing, finally left for Yan'an in 1936. Although mobilized by the same wartime ideology of national resistance, going to Kuomintang's wartime capital in Chongqing is certainly a very different political and life choice from that of going to the CCP headquarters in Yan'an. It seems that the different political ideas held by the 3 previous friends were the reason of their different political choices. However, observing their political and personal relations in the 1930s, I find that ideological difference could not always explain the divergence in intellectual women's political engagement and identification during the war. Cao Mengjun also joined the Communist Party in 1925 when she was enrolled in Beijing University. But her social and political relations were not just confined to the CCP. Before the war broke out, Cao Mengjun had also working for the Kuomintang Ministry of Industry, and in 1934, she married Wang Kunlun, a famous democratic intellectual who also held a high position in the Kuomintang. So I argue that the broad cross-party relations of Cao Mengjun helped her develop a further broad political network across different political parties, and helped her reinforce her position not just with the Kuomintang but also with many left-wing political networks in the 1940s. And similar to Cao Mengjun, Tan Tiwu also maintained complex political relations during the war. She worked for the Kuomintang Ministry of Interior for 15 years before becoming a Kuomintang legislator in 1947. However, being a civil servant did not make her a Kuomintang partisan, or her Kuomintang profile did not really contradict of her other political roles during the war. She was also a founding member and a director to some important left-wing women's organizations in Chongqing, and she kept close friendships with left-wing communist women leaders during the war. Therefore, neither Cao Mengjun nor Tan Tiwu was very different from Ding Ling's case in terms of their support, if also their belief in the Communist Party during the war. And it was not the ideological divide between the nationalist and the communist, however, the different ways that it managed and maintained their political and personal relations eventually led them to the different political paths. As early as 1926, Ding Ling already decided to leave her two friends for Shanghai, while Cao Mengjun and Tan Tiwu went to Nanjing instead. About this separation, Ding Ling said, "I do not understand why. Perhaps I did not agree with the life they chose. Perhaps they thought that I was too proud. Anyway, we went apart." However, Cao Mengjun and Tan Tiwu still maintained their political network as well as their friendship in Nanjing, and then they migrated together in Wuhan and then in Chongqing during the entire war period. Next, I'm going to talk about struggling between their political roles and gender roles during the war. And I'm going to give two examples, Chen Yiyun and Shen Zijiu. You can see Shen Zijiu is the lady standing in the middle, in the front row, and Chen Yiyun, the lady on the right-hand side. I argue that the centralized propaganda of national resistance and women's emancipation did not result in stereotyped wartime heroines or modern women simultaneously. Moreover, it was neither a coherent nor a linear progression in terms of women's identification with the different wartime ideologies and with the traditional norms in wartime China. To make it simple, the wartime mobilization for national resistance did not transform the traditional Chinese society overnight. Intellectual women, although determined to defend their political rights and their social independence, could not avoid the juggling between their political roles in public and their gender roles in private. Shen Zijiu, the lady in the middle, a very famous left-wing female leader of the National Salvation Association and the Democratic League during the war, had been through struggles in her personal and political relations. Shen Zijiu's first husband died of typhoid when she was only 21. Afraid of a lifelong widowhood as expected by traditional Chinese norms, she ran away from her husband's family and went to Japan to study. Her second marriage with a government official in Nanjing did not last any longer due to their different career pursuits. So once again, she left her husband and went to Shanghai. After the two failed marriages, Shen Zijiu completely changed her view on relationships and marriage. As she told the journalist in 1937, "If I had a husband again, I would like him to listen to me, support me, and obey my orders. I want him to help me to do things at home. After all, everyone is selfish." Similar to Shen Zijiu, Chen Yiyun, the female leader of the Kuomintang Central Women's Movement Committee, also encountered difficult decisions between relationship and career during the war. Chen Yiyun's relationship with her colleague, Mr. Guan, became very controversial for the reason that, first, this Miss Guan held the position much under Chen Yiyun, and also he had a wife at home. The public could not understand Chen Yiyun's choice for modern love for a man who had much lower political and social position, just as they could not accept Shen Zijiu's idea of finding a house husband. It was just supposed to be the other way around. Sarcasm was the first response to their challenge of the conventional gender roles. When the journal Objective criticized the political position of Chen Yiyun during the war, it also rudely questioned Chen Yiyun's age and marriage, as if they were relevant to the ridicule of this female government official. It says that, about her age, some people say that she's in her late 20s, but others say that she's in her 50s. No matter how old she actually is, in terms of marriage, she's still single, no husband. Therefore, for Chen Yiyun and Shen Zijiu, their marriage status were always of public interest, despite their political backgrounds and their professional positions. The fact that they both had abandoned their previous relationships or marriage sometimes were admirable, especially when models were required to showcase modern women during the war. Otherwise, the admiration for career women and for women's pursuit of political and political independence could quickly turn to sarcasm or even criticism, despite the seemingly overwhelming ideology of women's emancipation as an integral part of national resistance and liberation during the war. And next, I'm going to talk about the sense of victimhood and the sense of power. And due to the time limit, I can just go through the example of Liu Wang Liming. And if you're interested, you can see the example of Hu Ziying in my own paper. And Liu Wang Liming is the lady on the left-hand side in the first photo. So the war created the discourses of a personal sacrifice and enhanced the stereotyped images of national heroes and war victims. Intellectual women, despite their extraordinary study background, career achievements, and political positions, also faced the subject of loss and sacrifice. However, when women were referred as wartime victims or heroines, their political or gender roles were perceived through certain stereotypes. Thus, the nuanced and ever-changing meanings of these roles in different political contexts, or the relations and interactions between these roles, were overlooked. In 1938, Wang Liming, the lady on the left, her husband Liu Zhang'en, the president of Shanghai Hujiang University, was assassinated by Japanese agents. Wang Liming suddenly became a widow of 3 children and the next assassination target of the Japanese puppet troops in Shanghai. With no other choice, she asked the nanny to take her 2 sons to Shandong while she escaped to Hong Kong with her only daughter as refugees. 1 year later, Wang Liming managed to leave Hong Kong for the hinterland and reunited with her children in Chongqing. She officially put her husband's surname Liu before her own name to commemorate her late husband, a national martyr of the war. Adopting the husband's surname, however, was extremely unpopular among Chinese career women in the 1930s, who were very keen to claim their own social independence and equal political rights. Therefore, this double surname Liu Wang made Wang Liming conspicuous among the group of intellectual women during the war. For Liu Wang Liming, adopting her husband's surname was of course a way of commemorating, but to some extent, as a statement of her loss, sacrifice, and loyalty, the surname Liu Wang also conveyed a sense of victimhood, which in her case actually further transferred to her political motivation, if also her political credentials. Liu Wang Liming was said to have the spirit of martyrs when she was fighting for peace, freedom, and democracy during the wartime period. Her status as a widow of the national martyr reinforced her political identity as a female leader of the national resistance, and her political career appeared to be flourishing during the war. However, Liu Wang Liming's image as a wartime female leader and the widow of national martyr was continuously challenged and reshaped in different political contexts, especially after the war and after 1949. She was firstly persecuted by the Kuomintang during the civil war between 1946 and 1949 for being a left-wing activist, and then condemned by the Communist Party in 1957 for being a rightist bourgeoisie until she finally died in 1970 during the Cultural Revolution. So Liu Wang Liming's case shows us that intellectual women could suffer from the protracted wars in 1930s and 1940s in China in various ways, and more important, their victimhood could convey different meanings in different political contexts after the war. So here I come to the conclusion. The war of resistance was undoubtedly ideological, but the centralized ideas on national resistance and women's emancipation could not explain all the political maneuver and social changes in wartime China. The ideological divide between the nationalist and the communist, or that between traditional and modern, could not fully explain intellectual women's political choices and identities during the war. As a privileged group who engaged in various political parties and institutions, intellectual women have been through an unsettled and fragmentary process of political identification, during which the interactions and contradictions between their various political and gender roles transcended the wartime ideologies and reflected the dynamics of war, politics, and gender beyond the spatial and the temporal dimension of wartime China. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So our third presenter is Steve Ivings.
Ivings, yeah.
He's from the other history department at the IC, from economic history. His paper is titled Settling.
Should be settling. Sorry, that's a
Imperial
typo from me.
Japan's Far North, the ideology, policy, and practice of colonial settlement in Karafuto.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. First, I'd like to start by saying thank you to first allowing me to speak, and then also for listening to me. And then I should also start with an apology. So I'm an economic historian. So forgive me for all the data and charts. we all have our fetishes, right? So, okay, I'll get started. I'm kind of interested in ideology from a different angle from most people here, I guess. I'm looking at the kind of the interplay with ideology and then economic policy, and whether that has a negative or a positive effect, really. So I'm looking at Karafuto. I should start by saying where Karafuto is. This is basically going to be my agenda. First telling you where Karafuto is and something about it. Then looking at the ideology of colonial settlement in Karafuto. Then the policy which came out of that, and then the realities of colonial settlement. And then I'll be contrasting farming versus fishing settlements in Karafuto to try and make sense of this. And then I'll look at my conclusions and implications. So I'll get straight into it. Okay, Karafuto, Japan's place in the snow, as I title my my PhD thesis, is north of Hokkaido. So it's the northernmost territory in the Japanese empire. It was a colony from 1905. It was acquired after the Russo-Japanese War, but it had long been the scene of Russo-Japanese rivalry. The reality of the fact is it doesn't really matter if it was the Russians or the Japanese who discovered it first. Despite their various claims, there were already people living there. Okay, there were natives there, mostly Ainu. There were also some tribes from Siberia that had made the journey over there. It became a Russian penal colony after it was handed to Russia in an agreement in 1875. And then Japan won it back, and I say won it back, in 1905. And then it was a Japanese colony until 1945, when Russia got its revenge. It's cold, it's sparsely populated, and it's rich in natural resources: oil, coal, one of the richest fisheries in the world as well. So there's lots of fruity nuttiness in this colony as well. It's not just an empty wasteland, okay? As you can see, though, I said sparsely populated, but there were a number of urban settlements that developed there as well. So some parts of Karafuto would be very remote and lonely, whereas other ones would be actually very, strikingly modern settlements. So it's quite a diverse colony as well. And it became the scene of the second largest overseas Japanese population in the pre-war period. Okay, the ideology, so I guess I should really say my ism, as it were, the ism I'm looking at is colonialism, and then specifically settler colonialism. So basically it's the issue of what kind of colony should Karafuto be, and according to the academics, colonial officials, and most of the media throughout this period I'm looking at, it's quite strikingly one line, actually. They all seem to subscribe to the need to make this into a settler colony. It's described as a northern lifeline for the Japanese race, or a line of defense from Russia, as was Hokkaido previously, a possible contributor to imperial self-sufficiency, because that's in resources as well as food, a population safety valve, a place to transplant Japanese population and have it grow there, a potential paradise for farmers because of land was there in abundance and free, a new Japan, and specifically for Japanese as well, okay? Very exclusionary until the war years. Everyone was subscribing to the idea that it should become an agricultural colony. So I'm not really able to offer much in terms of debate about that. The most of the debate in terms of ideology was just about, how to make an agricultural colony, really. That was how it worked out. Okay. In terms of ideology and the aims of colonial settlement, overhanging with Karafuto is, we can see on the map, Hokkaido below. That was earlier a colony in the Meiji period, okay, in the early Meiji period. And so the experience there and the myths that surrounded the success story in Hokkaido had inevitable impacts on the ideology of Karafuto. So the idea that it was settled by military samurai farmers, samurais who became farmers, and that was the way forward to establish a permanent settlement. That kind of overhung here as well. Farming was always pushed over fishing. The colonization budget was basically all of the Department of Colonization's budget in Karafuto went to farming. Nothing for fishing, okay? Farmers were the preference because they established routes They were attached to the land. They bring their family with them, and they think long term. The fishermen just follow fish around. Farmers settle permanently. That was the idea, basically, which I'll challenge later on. It's not my view. Okay. If we look at just the population growth in Karafuto, I have here the population grew very rapidly and it grew very steadily, so we might look at this and say, success story. And after all, it became the second largest concentration of Japanese overseas. There was another ethnic population there. Koreans were certainly growing in the 30s as Japan mobilized for war and wanted to make use of the resources in Karafuto, so it imported Korean laborers. The Russian and native populations are relatively stagnant here and low in numbers. Okay, so unlike other colonies, Karafuto, analysing Karafuto allows us to kind of take a step back. I mean, there's a lot of literature on Japanese colonial administration, which stresses that they were very competent, they were scientific, they were learned administrators, but they struggled with the problems of what to do with the natives and the relations with the natives. In Karafuto, that was less of a problem. The settlers were the majority, so we can kind of see what happens. Are these really able administrators and policy makers, without that native dimension dominating the way the colony is run or defended, as it were. It's more about policy rather than policing, so that's one of the keys. My research questions are here. They are: did the agricultural vision come to fruition? Did that develop? And did the agricultural settlement program play a key role in settling Karafuto? Okay, were these colonial visions that the state had? Were they eventually colonial realities? Okay, the policy of settlement here, chronologically speaking, it's divided into two. This is a simplification to some extent, but we obviously have time limitations. There were no real restrictions on incomers, but after 1926 there was a favoured kind of group migration, which harked back to Hokkaido settlement. They were subsidising official settlers, so people who went through the official processes. But if you just turned up and tried to settle land, you wouldn't get subsidies, but you would get access to the land at least. There was always free access to the land. In terms of opening the land as well, there was more subsidy later on. Initially, the idea was that it would be a nationwide recruitment. They'd bring in farmers from all over Japan and contribute to saving the population pressure problem. But that kind of disappeared later on, as we'll see. If you were a migrant, you went to a place like this, where they processed your documents. If you're an official migrant, that was. This is in northern Hokkaido. And then you ended up in a place like this. Looks very similar. This is a temporary rest house for migrants. Okay, then you would travel free. You had free travel within Karafuto to this kind of place, which was an agricultural advisor station, where you would go and they would show you your land and they'd give you advice and help you get started. And here was your task, okay, clearing up land. This was opening land, backbreaking stuff. Later on they used tractors to get rid of those trees, but early on it was tough work, no doubt about it. You eventually got there and you had a farm like this, and this is supposed to be an advisor coming to talk to people, but I'm suspecting this is staged. The advisors weren't that regular visitors. Eventually you'd get settlements emerging like this. Okay. Other agricultural policies I'd like to mention, just in passing, these are interesting topics on their own, especially the first one. They pushed these ideas. Eat what you produce. Okay. In Karafuto, rice was not possible, so they were asking Japanese people not to eat rice. It didn't fly, actually. Focus on farming and limit side activities. So you should be, diligent farmers. Other economic activities are not important. They're not the way to go. And also subsistence before cash crops. So they wanted people to produce for themselves, and they didn't really want them to be very marketized, which is interesting for a capitalist country. The realities of colonial settlement and agriculture are very different. Maybe more on the picture later there. The reality was that there was a very low rate of settlement, okay, despite the growth in population being very rapid. And they failed to establish agriculture as a key sector in the Karafuto economy, and agriculture settlers were invariably dependent on other economic activities. I should get in there, okay. So this was the number of incoming settlers a year. We can see their up and downs. the major ups are during booms in other industries, which is interesting and tells us a lot. And the downs are usually during times when the economy was good in Japan, such as during World War I. There was rapid growth there, and you saw a fall in the number of people coming in. In the 30s, it's a bit more complex. I can't really go into that in too much detail. These are the origins of the incoming agricultural households. We can see that before they were mostly coming from Tohoku, there was this 20% or so from other prefectures that weren't coming from northern Japan, Tohoku and Hokkaido that is. They were coming from all over the country, and there was a peak in 1919 where we had almost 40% of them coming from these other regions, but eventually that kind of petered out, and then the majority of settlers were coming from within Karafuto itself. So, we can question whether they actually were settlers, were they really incomers? Well, I should say also that agricultural settlers had a low rate of settlement, okay? This can be shown, here we've got the actual number of agricultural households in Karafuto. It does go up relatively steadily, but in the late 1930s we have a negative trend there. But this is more important. So I have the same line there, which is now in black, but then the yellow line is the cumulative number of incoming agricultural households. So if I add each year to each year, and that would be the trend. If they all settled each year, that would be the line there. And we can see that by 1940, it's well under half of the actual incomers had settled as in agriculture. And that's an underestimation, because it's not including here, obviously, the people that had moved from other occupations, right? So these are the incomers from outside, which is very low rate of settlement there. Okay, agricultural settlement policy failed to establish agriculture as a key sector of the Karafuto economy. This is easy to show. These are the sectors of the economy, their percentage share. Agriculture is the green one because it's a countryside industry. We can see there it's always under 10%, and it eventually falls to 3.2% in 1940. Its lowest point there is 2.8%. It's very low. In terms of, if I put that next to here, the share of total employment, it's a slightly different story here. So total employment, it seems like there's lots of people doing agriculture, but not much output coming out of agriculture. So it's a low productive industry. Which is kind of a contradiction, but we could just come to the conclusion that they're poor, okay? That the poor members of Karafuto society, which is not true. The way of reconciling that would be to show you that agricultural settlers were dependent on other economic activities. So their income wasn't coming from agriculture, it was coming from elsewhere. That is also shown here. This is the average cultivated land per agricultural household. Now, 5 hectares was supposed to be the minimum, economic minimum, to make ends meet, to survive in agriculture in Karafuto. But the average was always below that. So that tells us they're not farming enough. How are they surviving? They're doing other things. Farmers weren't only farmers. In fact, there are a few surveys that were done and that survive. In 1932, there was a survey by the government itself which found that only 30% of an average farming household's income came from agriculture activity, but they registered themselves as principally farmers because they got tax breaks. 8 out of 10 of these so-called exemplary farmers, so these were people that were selected when Crown Prince Hirohito travelled to Karafuto the year before he became the emperor. Part of the ceremonies, they selected 10 exemplary farmers who had contributed to the success of Karafuto agriculture. I say with sarcasm. Of this 10, 8 of them had side activities. They were doing other things as well, so they weren't really farmers. And an average of 27% of their income was coming from other outside sources. So these are like the most successful farmers in Karafuto, and even then they're not really full-time farmers. They're doing other things as well. I couldn't really put too much of this stuff in here because it would take a long time. During my research, I collected around, must be about 800 different written and oral testimonies from settlers of Karafuto from various occupations. Most agricultural families confirm that they did side work, and it was often the main activity. It's difficult to give you too many anecdotes without eating into my time. They worked in forestry, fishing, construction, transportation, as peddlers of various goods, as shop owners, innkeepers, coal miners, charcoal makers, and general labourers. There was a lot of work in Karafuto because there were so many natural resources that could be developed, and it was very sparsely populated, so there was high demand for labour. So, they could demand high wages, in various industries, and they did so. To really kind of seal the deal and show that farming wasn't the way to go in Karafuto, and the kind of the ideology of building an agricultural base was a bit false, I'll contrast it with fishing, which was given as the industry that should be avoided by most of the colonial policy makers, because they saw fishers as untrustworthy people who move from place to place, make money quick, and then when the stocks go down they move on. It wasn't the case, because fishing is expensive business and you have to invest a lot of your money and set up a base to do so. So the big question is, were agricultural villages more likely to be permanently settled than fishing villages? And fishing villages were based on migratory labour as well, so they imported a lot of migratory labourers to come in the fishing season to fish basically. Whereas there was a permanent population, certain times of the year there was a massive influx. Ways of looking at that one would be here, looking at the number of men per 100 women. So a settler colony can be defined by some people, and there's a very famous painting of this as well, as the moment when a colony becomes a settler colony is when the women arrive, when the wives arrive. Okay, so that's when the family's permanent, the society has a way of reproducing itself. Okay, so we should have 100 to 100, more or less. That's what the case would be in most countries around the world, unless there's female infanticide. But we can see here that, although basically the same, fishing villages were slightly better off here, closer to 100. Very, 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 very fine there. In terms of number of dependents as well, so this is the size of the family. We'd expect, they said, agricultural households, they have families, they call their family members from their home villages to come. They had only 0.9 dependents per worker in each household, whereas fishing had 1.1, so they were having more children, they had larger families, fishers. Here we've got this is my way of measuring permanence. In Japan you have a thing called a honseki, which is your permanent residence, okay, where your family is registered. And Karafuto was the only colony where you could establish your permanent residence as a Japanese citizen. Okay, you could establish that as your permanent home. So you could transfer your family register to Karafuto from 1924 onwards. This is in 1930. We've got in green here agricultural villages, and then we've got red is just some random other ones, and then the blue here is fishing villages. And the higher percentages, the more residents who have established a permanent residence and moved their family register to the settlement in Karafuto. We can see the fishing villages are higher than average, and they're higher than agricultural settlements as well. This is only a selection here. I couldn't add them all on now. If we correlate them as well, the story is the same. We can see here higher percentage of permanent addresses in Karafuto is associated with a higher percentage occupied in fishing, and that's a positive relationship going up there. Whereas in agricultural households, agricultural villages, the relationship is the opposite way. It's negative. Okay. I think I'll have to skip this. I'll just briefly say that migratory labour was my way of describing why Karafuto's population moved up. There were 15,000 to 14,000 every year migratory labourers coming in, depending on the economic conditions of the year. And we can even see that from fishermen coming in from one prefecture, Aomori prefecture, between 1910 and 1940 is about the same as the total number of colonists, agricultural colonists coming in as well. So that's just from one prefecture, and it wasn't the biggest sender of migratory labourers either. Migratory migratory labourers migratory labour meant there were connections with hometowns in Japan and settlements in Karafuto that were kept every year. So this also familiarised migratory labourers and gave them information on the colony. So it was a disseminator of information and it kept it connected. I have to skip that one. My conclusion implications. I'll just go with the conclusion. Did the agricultural vision come to fruition? No. Did the agricultural settlement program play a key role in settling Karafuto? No. And did state colonial visions create colonial realities? No. So basically this obsession with agriculture was not conducive to creating a permanently settled colony. It was more migratory labour. I haven't had the time to go into that in too much detail here, but migratory labour also helped play a key role in replenishing the incomes of agricultural settlers too. So as you remember, only 30% of 30% of income of agricultural settlers was coming from agriculture itself. The implications, I guess we could say, what I'm getting at here is this idea of the general effectiveness of Japanese colonial administration is a bit dubious. Okay, even in the case where they weren't, called up in managing Koreans and managing Taiwanese, they still made the wrong policies. So, thank you.
Our last speaker is Mark Walsh, and Spooner is in there, who's from the Institute of Education / Birkbeck, and he's giving a paper titled The International Language, the Changing Face of the Other in Japan's School English Textbooks.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, I'm from the IOE, but I'm co-supervised by Professor Shimazu at Birkbeck, which accounts for my hybrid status. I'm studying about the English textbooks used in Japanese public schools since the Second World War. And my particular focus is to look at the way in which these textbooks act to reinforce or perhaps even create conceptions of Japanese national identity and some more vague ideas of Japan's place in the world. Now, these kinds of questions, it's very common to look at school curriculums to investigate these kinds of issues. People look at history textbooks, of course, very famously in the case of Japan, social studies and national language textbooks and so on. But I think the case of English textbooks is also interesting and comparatively neglected. I should say the case of foreign language textbooks, of course, in this case, English being the foreign language par excellence in Japan. And in the case of Japan, I think the reason English is so interesting when we're thinking about Japan's place in the world and Japan's conceptions of its own national identity is because of the historical background of English in Japan. There's a tendency which we still have today, I think, in many countries, but also in Japan, to consider English as an international language. And the argument goes that it would be a fine thing if there was a standard language which everybody in the world could use to communicate with. English is probably the most widely spoken language, certainly is a second language, and it's certainly the most widely distributed language. And if we take those two propositions, we come to the conclusion that, well, English should be the international language. But this has been critiqued in the last 20 years particularly, and in the case of Japan there are special critiques. And this is why I use the question mark for the international language. So certainly in Japan, English has been presented as something that should be studied from a utilitarian perspective, something that can be used to import knowledge from abroad, as it was during the Meiji period. And we have similar arguments today when English is the language of business and the internet, for example. But also English has not been able to avoid, in a way, also being associated with certain ideologies. It's very closely linked with the West, with America in particular. And going back to the 19th century, it was associated with modernity, with science, with liberalism, democracy, and today perhaps with globalization, we could say. This association with external ideologies has also allowed English to emerge as a representative of the foreign and the other in Japan, and particularly the Western other. And it's this function of English as something which can be compared against an ideal conception of Japanese identity, which gives English a quite unique status. It's at once the language which is used to communicate with the outside world, but it's also a representative in important ways of what the outside world constitutes. And so, starting from that point, I wanted today to talk about the way in which this other is presented in Japan's textbooks. And I wanted to talk about America and Europe and lots of different places, but that would have taken far too long. So I decided actually to focus on depictions of Asia in these school textbooks, since of course this is the Comparative Histories of Asia series. And also it's extremely interesting in its own right. And of course we have to note that Asia in this conceptualization excludes Australia and New Zealand, and also Japan itself, which some people might have strong opinions about. But of course, from my point of view, it's simply a methodological conceit. When I look at the images of Japan in the textbooks, I like to separate those from the rest of Asia. But of course, Japan is part of Asia. Okay, so before we really get into that, I should just state that obviously my study has limitations. I'm looking only at textbooks used in junior high schools, which comprise pupils of the age of 12 to 15. I'm looking at the post-war period from 1947, when the modern system was re-established, to 2006, which is the year that the most recent textbooks were published. Actually, that has changed now. I think there were textbooks produced in 2012, but I have to draw the line somewhere. And I'm only looking at 3 publishers which are listed there, but those 3 publishers have accounted for 90% of the market of English textbooks in Japan, so it's a very significant subset of all the books used in Japanese schools. Okay, so first of all I wanted to talk about the way in which representations of Asia have increased very dramatically. And this is a page from a 1958 textbook which shows the cast of characters, the teacher and some pupils, and you can immediately see that they're all Caucasian, and in fact they are American. And this textbook series is set in America, and from memory I think actually all the characters which feature in the textbook are American. This now is the 2006 version, and immediately you can see there's a much more international cast. The first thing which is important is that there's a very strong now Japanese bias. Actually most of the characters are Japanese. But for today's discussion, the important thing is also to note that there's an international cast. There's a Chinese boy and an Indian girl, as well as an Australian girl, and some other nationalities as well. And these anecdotes are supported by a slightly more rigorous quantitative analysis. So just here I've taken selected years and shown you the number of lessons which include mentions of Asian places, descriptions of cities and countries and so forth, and also the number of characters who are Asian who are given speaking parts in these books. And as you can see, the trend is to increase, and there's a particular explosion after 1990, which we perhaps can get into the reasons for why that might be so later on if we have time and interest. And again, of course, when I say Asian, I'm excluding Japan, Australia and New Zealand from this categorization. But this expansion of interest in Asia and depictions of Asian people and places is also matched by a change in perspective. And I've said this is a Western lens to a Japanese lens, and I'll try to explain what I mean. Here's an example from the 1950s again, and this really could be something out of Rudyard Kipling. The lesson's called The Tiger, and the entire lesson's about ways of hunting tigers. And this is the final page, and it tells you the most exciting way to hunt a tiger is to go in on foot with your gun and shoot it. But of course you have to be careful to kill it straight away, because no animal is more dangerous than a wounded tiger. So, as I say, this is really kind of Kipling-esque. And it's fairly typical of the way in which Asia is presented in the 1950s. Another example is that the conquest of Everest is presented in a very Western-focused way, talking about the various British, American expeditions. Also, when it comes to literature, we see the same thing. There are lessons which present the story of Aladdin and Ali Baba, stories like that. But these are stories which, of course, although they may have roots in Middle Eastern folklore, are known, I think, in Japan, certainly in the West, through the translations of the Arabian Nights and the various parodies, Edgar Allan Poe and so on. And it's these adaptations which are presented in the textbooks. So it's Asian content, but it's seen through a Western lens. Moving on from that, though, we can see this shift to a Japanese lens. This is from the 1970s, and we now, of course, start to have Japanese and Asian characters featuring in the textbooks. And this lesson presents a Japanese boy, Goro, whose father visits Southeast Asia, Singapore and Malaysia. And he talks about his experiences there. Notably, he talks about the languages there. And we see on the first page there, just at the bottom, he talks about the various languages spoken in Malaysia, I think. And then he talks about, how about Japan? Is it a country of one race and one language? Have we had any language wars? And you can see immediately here, we've got this now comparison of Japan with monolingual and perhaps monocultural Japan with multilingual, multicultural Asia, which is a direct challenge to this conception of Japan comparing itself with the West. Further comparisons with the way people eat with fingers. And in a later edition, actually in this edition you can see it might be strange to eat with your fingers, but of course Japanese children do eat onigiri and hamburgers with their fingers too, so it's not so strange. And this kind of lens continues also with the literature. There are plays which feature Chinese characters, but these plays are actually adaptations of well-known Japanese comic theatre, kyogen. So these are presented in English translation with Chinese characters, which is quite interesting. A final note on this Japanese lens. There's also a sense that Japan is being linked to Asia in a way, which was not apparent in the previous series, which were what I mean to say is when images of the West were presented, there was not necessarily a link to Japan directly associated with them. But in these representations of Asia, there's often a direct link to Japan provided. For instance, in a lesson on landmines in Cambodia, the framing device is that a Japanese volunteer has gone out to Cambodia to help protect children from landmines and to engage with the local community. Finally, I wanted to say that perhaps we are moving beyond this Western and Japanese lens. Perhaps there's now an Asian lens. As the Asian characters have been introduced from the 1990s, there's an opportunity for the Japanese characters to actually, for the Asian characters to actually be used to present information about Asia. And that's something we have here. Where we have this girl born in China who grew up in Singapore, who talks about Singapore. And again, there's a focus on the languages that they use. And again, interestingly, though, later in this lesson, they talk about the links to Japan, the way in which the police box system was imported from Japan, the way that lots of Japanese visit Singapore, and the way that many Singapore people are interested in learning Japanese. So I'm not sure that this Asian lens actually is fully developed. There's still very much this connection to Japan. So just to finish off then, I wanted to just return to this issue of the international language. These images of Asia are now much more prevalent in Japanese textbooks, and to a large extent they've supplanted the previous images of America. But does that mean that there's a suggestion that English is an appropriate language to be used as an international language for Asia? And surprisingly, it actually isn't so clear-cut. this lesson features a Japanese man, Mr. Saito, who you can see in the middle, and he visits Papua New Guinea, working as a volunteer teaching. But the lesson is actually quite heartfelt in a way, as textbook lessons go. He talks about how he tried to use English to communicate, and his students were just bored. They didn't understand and they didn't like it. But then he tried to use the Pidgin English or Creole, Tok Pisin, which is used in Papua New Guinea by some members of the community. And suddenly they really liked his lessons and they really liked him and were chatting to him in the street. And so it's a really direct example of the failure of standard American English to function as an international language in Asia. And there are other lessons which suggest the same when children go to visit Korea and China, and they're inspired to use Korean and Chinese rather than try to communicate in English as a common language. And this is the last page of the 2006 textbook, and it really illustrates this very well. The lesson is about signing, so it talks about how this child has now learned how to use sign language. And then she says, having studied English for 3 years, now I can speak English so I can communicate with English-speaking people. I have a chance to share my feelings, ideas, and thoughts with more and more people. I want to learn other languages like Chinese, Hindi, and Korean. Then my world will become bigger and better. So we're moving really very far from this idea now that English is an international language which will give us access to these other Asian countries, and in fact a deeper and more local connection is required, which is actually quite interesting to see in English textbooks. So just in conclusion, these depictions of Asia have increased since 1990. There's certainly a shift from a Western lens on Asia to a Japanese lens, and there may be an emerging shift to an Asian lens. But this is not an unproblematic example of simplest internationalization. This association with Japan has also emerged, and actually the dominant trend is probably an increase in the Japanese content of the textbooks. And certainly the role of English as an international language for Asia is not uncontested. Thank you very much.
So what I think we might do now is have our 4 speakers come up, if that's okay, and then you can speak to us as you answer our questions. Otherwise we all have to twist our necks to try and find you. So I have three questions and a slightly longer one. And since I'm chairing, I'm going to stumble through my questions while you all formulate more coherent ones. Thank you all. I thought there were 4 very different takes on ideology, our theme for this session. I want to remind you all, by the way, we have booze at the end, so please stay if you can. So very quickly, my questions. Steve, this is short. What are the intellectual origins of this vision? Right? I know that the intellectual origins that associate agriculture with civilization in Western literature, but are they the same in Japanese in this period? Mark, are we moving from believing English is going to connect us all to questioning that? Or are we moving from believing that one language can connect us all to a sort of multilingual, an acceptance or an encouragement of learning multiple languages? Josh, you ask if Lai Teck conforms to existing ideologies, right? You say he's consistent, but I wonder if you might also ask how he's contributing to these ideologies, and why you've chosen to ask that whether he conforms rather than asking that other question about his contribution as if it were something original. And finally, this slightly longer question for Vivienne about the connection between the arguments about women's emancipation and ideologies, nationalism or communism. It seems very clear to me there's a connection between communism, at least ideologically, and women's emancipation. And in terms of nationalism, the relationship is more complicated, I think. So in India, for example, the women's movement is basically told by the nationalist movement, we'll deal with you later. Don't press your issues. after we all get independence, you give us, work for nationalism. After we get independence, then your moment will come. And then after they get independence, they're told to work on social issues. And so really, at least in nationalism in India, the women's question is really subordinated. And I'm wondering if that is not the case in the Chinese nationalist case. I got the sense that that wasn't the case, that they were promising women's emancipation. So I wonder if you could clarify that for me. Those are my questions. I hope you all have really good ones. Shall I let them all answer my questions? And then I'll gather 3, because I'm more important. No, there's a lot for them to remember. And then I'll gather 3 and then we'll go. Yeah? Okay.
Where shall we start? Maybe ladies first?
Since you, Josh, since you
went first. Yeah, we do it the order.
Okay, in answer to your question, did Lai Teck contribute anything ideologically? I think that the short answer is probably no. What happened in the early 1930s in Malaya, an agent of the Comintern was arrested and they raided his house and got a list of names, and it really blew the Comintern in Southeast Asia, even going as far to Shanghai. Ho Chi Minh fled to Hong Kong, was put in prison for 6 months, and the Malayan Communist Party was, to all intents and purposes, nullified at that point. And they lost contact with the wider world. You then have Lai Teck coming in as an agent of the British, claiming to be this big expert, part of the Comintern, and saying he'd been to France, he'd been to Moscow. And there is some evidence that to a certain extent that's true. He was in Shanghai, he was a communist in Indochina as well, and so he'd come in saying, I have the message, as it were, and I can show you the way, but there is no real evidence of him actually contributing anything new. What happened was, and I sort of mentioned it in my presentation, is that you had a very young, if you like, naive group of communists that had very little contact with the outside world at that point in time. And so I don't know whether you would say that he hoodwinked them. He must have had some knowledge, and they did have some exposure to Marxist literature. But no, I don't think he really contributed anything so much as used it as a tool.
Sure, that's fair. Okay.
Thank you for the question. I think when we're talking about women's emancipation, especially in Republican China, we always cannot avoid talking about the dichotomy between women and nation, or between feminism and communism, or feminism and nationalism, as if they were always together, as if the nation's liberation was kind of related to women's liberation, or women's emancipation was an integral part of the nation's emancipation as well, may it be from imperialism or from feudalism, as Chinese say, whatever feudalism actually meant, or from capitalism. So, but the reason that I'm interested in the different roles played by especially intellectual women during that period was to find out actually the sort of the difference or the contradictions between what women is supposed to be believed by, what the nation is supposed to be. For example, to link women with modernity, to link women with the liberation of the nation from imperialist suppression of the time. So it's a very complex picture. For example, if you look at the Communist Party's ideology during the time, it always says that gender equality is one of our concepts, and therefore men and women are supposed to be, especially comrades, supposed to have the same political roles. However, if you read the Dingling's memoir, when she actually converted to communism and went to Yan'an in 1936, she complained a lot about the so-called equality between male and female. She said that always females' marriages and females' traditional rules were of the public interest, and it was not actually certainly the case. And sometimes women's, how would I say that, labor roles of women, like how they could produce, how they could help with the production, were also used by communist ideologies, especially in 1950s, to create this kind of Iron Lady sort of identities, to say that as if women have the equal positions with men, but actually they will only just have the equal sort of responsibilities, but not the equal rights. And when I'm talking about nationalists, I'm not talking about nationalism, because this idea was kind of a more complex and the different versions of nationalism in Republican China and also in contemporary China. But I'm more talking about the nationalist parties, the Kuomintang. So for Kuomintang, it was a similar case actually. So for some period of time, especially during 1930s, when they were trying to promote the idea of a new culture, the new life movement, they tried to reinforce women's traditional roles as a reinforced idea of a good mother and wise wives. However, during the war, sometimes when, as I mentioned, when they actually need models, modern women or women heroines, they certainly try to admire other women's more, independent roles. So I'd say that the ideologies during the Republican China during that period of time was very complex, as the actual political roles and gender roles held by women during the time.
Sure, thank you.
Okay, I'll repeat the question just so we're clear where we're going. So what are the origins of this kind of agrarian ideology? This agriculture is supposed to be the base of a good, healthy colony. It's got dual origins, as a lot in Japan in this period does. So it has a Japanese tradition as well as a Western tradition. There was colonial studies developing in Japan at the time, and a large number of the scholars, their material was material coming from experience of Western colonies, studies on Western colonies, stories about how America was settled and stuff like that. They were reading these things. Then also you've got a Japanese tradition as well. Of course, if we go back, I know it's a bit cliche, but if we go back to the feudal period, if that's the right term to use for that period of time, the Edo era, of course, there was a massive dependence on agriculture for the economy to work in many ways. And a lot of the elites who were making the policies obviously had backgrounds as high-ranking officials in various clans and domains across Japan where they'd been living off the back of peasants. So surely they wanted to recreate that. Other than that as well, within Japan, so there's the Hokkaido tradition, which is very large. Okay, so Hokkaido, Karafuto is basically a Hokkaido too. It's a bad version of Hokkaido, one that didn't go so well. So Hokkaido is earlier as well. So a lot of the people who's going to work in Karafuto and make the policies, you've got a number of people coming out of Hokudai, so Hokkaido Daigaku, Hokkaido University, and they've obviously grown up in that university in learning from Hokkaido's experience as a colony. And some of them also were people who, if you look at their backgrounds, they had a background in settling Hokkaido as samurai settlers, for example. So they kind of subscribe to that official view of how Hokkaido was settled, which I doubt, but that's another kettle of fish or something else I have to touch on. So it's got kind of a diverse, there's Western studies which are influencing them, as well as a Japanese tradition as well.
Yeah, so I think the question was that, or is it not so much that we're moving away from an idea that English is the international language to the idea that there cannot be an international language? Would that be,
or rather English plus, rather than either yes English or no English. Maybe we've moved from only English to English and other things. Right?
Yeah, I think that's certainly one of the trends which seems to be evident in the textbooks. But I think there's a long history in Japan and more generally of the idea of any international language being able to function, becoming more and more problematic, and particularly English because of its associations with colonialism and with the kind of imperialistic baggage which is pointed to by critical scholars the last 20 years or so. But I think in the particular case of these Japanese textbooks, we have to remember that there's quite a large time lag in the way that the ideology ends up in the pages of the textbook. And most of the people who are writing these textbooks and editing them are Japanese academics and educators, probably towards the middle to late stages of their careers, so 50s, maybe even into their 60s. And so I think it's probably fair to say as a generalisation, they've grown up with an idealised vision of English as a language that could be used to engage fully with the outside world. And I think as time's progressed, various landmarks along the way, the normalisation of relations with China, the opening of China in the 1980s, and then also these critiques, as I say, that emerged academically of the validity of English as an international language, and the recognition that English is not a unified language, but there are varieties within countries and between countries. I think that's developed over time and has gradually resulted in this, in the mindset of the textbook authors, and now being attuned to this idea that yes, indeed, there are alternatives to English, and perhaps that even English is not necessarily the most appropriate language in many cases, and that's certainly starting to filter through. Where it will go from here, I'm not sure.
Sure, thank you. I'll take a few questions. I saw your hand, Owen, if you want.
Yeah, I mean, both the questions I have for Steve and Mark are both ones that you kind of just, I don't know. Oh, okay, I'll just, for the sake of it, I'll say, because it's a bit different. I think the thing I wanted to ask Steve was about it's about the origins of the ideology as well, but was this part of was it linked into kind of global ideologies of settlement? It just made me think instantly, and I'm no expert on this at all, but it made me think of Zionist settlement in Palestine and kibbutz and that kind of whole culture around that, which just seems to be very agriculturally focused. I'm struggling to think of any other examples, but I mean, I wonder if it's Australia, yeah. Maybe even internal settlement in Russia as well. I don't know about the history of that, but this idea of kind of empty wild land, which of course Palestine wasn't, but anyway,
it's sold as that to some extent, isn't it?
Yes, it was sold as that, which should be tamed, and culture is the way to do that.
Yeah.
So, sorry, we're going to take a few.
I'll take a few, no problem.
So, Roger, and over here.
Actually, might have to speak as well, if I may. Firstly, I just had a detailed question. When your statistics for agriculture, did they include forestry? And And when you were talking about you saying migratory labour was in fact what kept on the float.
Yeah.
I mean, but you have this in opposition to agriculture. But I mean, the migratory labour is like being employed for somebody else, whereas settling is being self-employed. I mean, surely migratory labour could be we're very likely to be in agriculture, would it not?
Not in the case of Karafuto.
Okay, so
we'll get to that.
Unless you have a question for Steve, and then I'll okay.
My question is general to any one of the speakers. Was how do you expect your research to add value and originality to existing research and historiography on the subject you've chosen?
Okay.
Oh, the $1 million question, that one, isn't it? Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah, okay. So let Steve go and the rest of you can stew on that.
Okay. So global currents. So I mean, I don't know what they were reading, but I do know who they're inviting to like various surveys and whatnot, and it's invariably people from Hokkaido University who are going there. Hokkaido University has behind Tokyo University, it was the centre for colonial studies for obvious reasons in Japan, and it has a tradition of influence of American academics. so the story of America in particular has influenced Hokkaido. There are various books on that, the idea of the frontier in the snow rather than in the desert, as it were. Consequently, there are many Western style movies made about Hokkaido's frontier expansion. But they are reading, we can certainly see by their collections of books have now been passed to the main library as these scholars have passed away. And that they're reading, they're very well read on colonial policy across the world. So they're certainly influenced by global currents. And it's not just in Japan, of course, that agriculture is seen as, making agricultural settlements is seen as the key to establishing a successful and permanent colony. In Japan's case, it's a bit more, strategic than it would be, let's say, in South Africa. Because of it's right on Japan's doorstep, it's got a defence element to it for the homeland as well. But yeah, they certainly are following global currents as well. They are, but they're unable to think independently of both the Japanese tradition of agriculture being the centre. They're not able to get away from that, as well as criticise. They're kind of accepting as it is the Western and the global currents. So that's my criticism of them. They should think outside the box a little bit more and look at the reality. The next question was on separating first forestry and agriculture. It's a painful process looking through the census and doing that, but I did do it. It took a long time. It's very important in Karafuto's case because forestry is a very important industry. When I showed the sectors of the economy, and manufacturing was very high, that was manufacturing mostly of paper and pulp and lumber, which was obviously coming out of the forestry industry. So that was certainly after World War I, that was the key industry. So I had to make sure I separated all that out. It was time consuming, but it's been done. So that's if I did that, it would look like, if I didn't do that, it would look like agriculture is dominating, if it was agriculture and forestry. But actual farming itself, in that sense, it's different. Migratory labour was the key for all other industries in Karafuto other than agriculture, really. Fishing depended on it, forestry depended on it. I didn't really get the time to develop it to too much detail. I've collected migratory labourers' testimonies as well, and they often are full of anecdotes where they went to Karafuto almost every year for migratory labour, 3 or 4 months, earned good money, went home, enjoyed themselves, or maybe enjoyed themselves on the way home, and they spread stories about how you can make good money up there, and other people went with them. They keep going. Eventually they settle down. That was a more common pattern than people going as official migrants, getting lands, the deed to land, and then starting a farm and successfully continuing with that till they pass it on to the next generation. People didn't necessarily intend to settle, but in reality did. That's often one of the things that emerges in Karafuto's case. I think I should stop there and we go to the general value thing. Good luck. Good luck.
Welcome to answer that.
I'll go. Well, I think most accounts of English in Japan sort of approach the issue from the way in which English acts as a counterpoint to an ideal of Japanese, and both the languages are facets of the totality of the culture. So they look at the way in which English is contrasted to Japanese, which makes Japanese seem to be a unique language, and that feeds back into a conception of Japan as a unique society, a unique culture. And it's English as a representation of the West, or as America, which is the counterpoint, which is compared to validate Japan's uniqueness. The other approach is to take a more global view and to see the way in which English is expanding around the world and interacting with Japanese society. And that approach is the approach taken by critical linguists who see English loaded with this cultural baggage of imperialism, post-colonialism and so on. And my approach really was to look at the English textbooks and to try to say, well, actually, are either of these approaches valid? And I think, as I've tried to show to some extent today, they're not, because it's not simply a case that English is associated with only the West. There's a great deal more to it. And in Japan's case, it's not the case that English is either a neutral international language or an invading, dominating external force. Again, there's a lot more negotiation with the society. And it's kind of between those, in the crevices between those arguments, that I try to find something original to say.
I think you asked what's the value of what we're doing, or what's original. I think in my case, what I'm looking at is I'm looking at a colonial city, Singapore, that was just over 100 years a colonial city, and so there was no such thing, if you like, as a Singaporean at that point in time. Additionally, we've got people that made compromise, or were compromised already by colonialism, but they'd made a success of it before the Second World War, made a success during the Second World War, and then made a success after the Second World War. And so somehow they were able to negotiate through sort of like 3 significant changes. And when you think that certainly for the 20th century, most people did things in the name of one particular ism or another. And so how do you maintain a position through all these changes? Is it the ism? Is it not the ism? Is it a complication between the two? And I think it was something Mark said about the gaps. It's the gaps, and the more complicated, the more compromised it is, I think the more interesting. And so as far as how original I can be depends on the ongoing research.
I think basically I'm interested in intellectual women as a very special social and political group itself. It's kind of, for myself at least, it's very interesting because in the past when you talk about or when you research on women as a kind of a collective group, you normally focus on women's identity as the surprised or as the opposite to men. But intellectual women, in my case, they have 2 different identities. One is that they were women, and also they were intellectuals. So when, especially Chinese historians, when they look at women in Republican era, they certainly either grouped women to just as general ordinary women as opposite to males, or they just put intellectuals as their opposite to say that Chinese intellectuals during the period were the ones that created the identities of women, or modern women, or traditional women. So what I was interested in was intellectual women as very special social group, and how they play the role of not just the materials for their male intellectuals to think about the identity of women of the time, but also play the role of the producers of ideologies during the time. I think that's basically what I consider as the value of this research.
So I'm going to let these four have a drink. If you would like. Thank them in the normal way once again. We have had, I think, a very productive session.